A warm welcome to the show. This is Direct Talk. Last week on Monday, Amnesty International released a report saying Eritrean forces committed war crimes and possible crimes against humanity in Tigray after the signing of a peace deal. For more on this, I'm joined by Sarah Jackson. She is Amnesty International's Deputy Regional Director for East and Southern Africa. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
That's good, thanks.
Sarah, tell us more about the report. What are the key findings of the report?
Sure. So last week we launched our report, which looks at war crimes and possible crimes against humanity by the Eritrean Defence Forces in Tigray region shortly before and immediately after the cessation of hostilities between the federal government and the TPLF. We have documented cases of extrajudicial executions of civilians, of rape, of sexual slavery, and pillage. This is in two specific districts, in Mariam Shawito district before the cessation of hostilities, and in Kokopshaba after the cessation of hostilities for up to almost 3 months. When we're looking at what happened in Mariam Shawito district shortly before the cessation of hostilities, we have documented the extrajudicial execution of 20 civilians. We have also received information of many more cases that we have not been able to remotely verify. In Kokopsaba, we have documented the extrajudicial execution of 24 civilians, and we have also documented cases of sexual slavery by the Eritrean Defence Forces of women who they held for this period, both in a military camp and also in residential houses. In both locations, Amnesty International documented pillage of the belongings, the livestock of these families.
The Pretorius Peace Agreement stipulates the withdrawal of external forces. In light of the time the crimes were committed, can we say the crimes wouldn't have been committed if the Pretorius Peace Agreement was implemented completely?
Well, these violations were committed by Eritrean Defence Forces who remained in Tigray region. I think one of the primary concerns of Amnesty International is that violations committed throughout the conflict have largely gone unpunished. And it's absolutely critical that there are investigations and prosecutions into these and to other violations that have taken place in the conflict in northern Ethiopia, including in Tigray. And there are some transitional justice provisions in the agreement, but there's been very little movement on these.
The Eritrean forces continue to occupy some parts of eastern, central and northwestern Tigray, committing these heinous crimes. What do you think should be the role of the international community and the federal government for these crimes to stop?
Well, the Ethiopian government has a responsibility to investigate and prosecute those responsible for these crimes, namely the Eritrean forces in this situation. At the moment, that seems to be unlikely, and it's particularly important that other investigations happen too. Amnesty International is standing with several other organizations in calling for the renewal of the International Commission mandated by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate crimes in the conflict in northern Ethiopia and to preserve evidence. We're also calling for the African Commission to reinstate their commission of inquiry into the situation in Tigray region. That was prematurely disbanded without even the publication of a report into its findings. So it's really critical that there are regional and international investigations into the current situation and that evidence is preserved so that families of victims and survivors of these violations might one day see justice.
The report also recommended the United Nations Human Rights Council to extend the mandate of its commission in Ethiopia. How do you think the extension of the mandate of the commission would support efforts to bring the atrocities that are committed against civilians in Tigray to light?
Well, Essentially, what we see in a number of contexts is the longer it takes to see viable justice mechanisms established, the more difficult it is to get evidence to underpin prosecutions. And one of the roles of the Human Rights Council mandated investigation is to gather and to preserve evidence. And this is important in so many ways. It's important to underpin any justice eventually, but it's also important for the historical record of what's happened. It's important so that there is truth about what's happened, and hopefully one day it might also be part of ensuring that survivors would get reparations.
How should the federal government and the Tigray interim administration help the International Commission if its mandate is extended?
Well, if its mandate is renewed, it's really important that they have full access to Ethiopia so that the federal government, the interim administration in Tigray, ensure that they can move freely across the country, that they can speak freely with people, that they can gather information. That hasn't been the case to date, which obviously has limited their work.
The report also recommended the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to reconsider its decision to terminate the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry into Human Rights Violations in Tigray. Earlier that week, Amnesty International, alongside other civil society organizations, sent an open letter to the Commission expressing concern over the termination of the mandate. What exactly is Amnesty pressing for?
Well, together with other organizations, Ethiopian organizations, other African organizations, global organizations, we're calling for the African Commission to reinstate that Commission of Inquiry, and at the very least to make sure that it publishes a report of its findings. It's absolutely appalling that it's been disbanded without publishing the information that it's gathered to date. It owes that to the survivors, to the witnesses that he has interviewed and that it has spoken with, to be able to present a record of their findings. This is important to the situation in northern Ethiopia, but more broadly, it is important as a signal of commitment of African-led justice, African-led justice mechanisms and instruments across the continent. I mean, at this point, we don't see a transitional justice process unfolding in Ethiopia that would lead to accountability for the range of violations that have been committed. We see a focus on reconciliatory approaches over trials, and it's absolutely vital that the issue of impunity, which has been long-standing in Ethiopia over several administrations, is addressed. And so it's for this reason that we think that these regional and international bodies still have a role to play.
Finally, Sarah, what kind of precedent do you think it can set if these crimes are left unpunished?
I mean, it sets an incredibly bad precedent if these atrocities are left unpunished. In a way, it's not a precedent because there are previous serious violations in Ethiopia and in several other countries in the region, including in South Sudan, that have gone unpunished. But it prevents the country, it prevents the region from moving forward, and it makes it more likely that similar situations could occur again.
Sarah Jackson, Amnesty International's Deputy Regional Director for East and Southern Africa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. You're welcome.